I think, the final piece here is how do we structure the deal, right? And what's that kind of that emotional transition after selling the business? And I've talked to so many people when it comes to, okay, yes, they're giving me my ask of $1 million for the business, but now in the fine print or in the agreement, they want to give me half up front, and then the other half is over 3 years, and they want to link it to if there's going to be cancellations or not. And I've seen quite a few structures. This is definitely, I wouldn't say my strongest area, and I would lean on you guys for deal structuring. So I'll maybe have David kick off. What is the optimal kind of setup, and as far as the deal structure, something that is fair? And I guess it also maybe depends, and I'll let you answer this, but why you're selling the business, right? If you're selling, obviously, if it's something, you're going through a divorce, or that's going to be a different sell. But if this is the legacy and you're looking at that retirement, talk us through kind of different structures and any types of recommendations.
So every seller who ever sells a business wants to get a check on closing day. I've never met one who didn't. Right. And so that's the starting point, because we've been talking throughout these 3 different conversations about all the potential problems that a buyer might see in a business: lack of systems, owner dependence, concentration with one supplier, tax returns and financials that don't match, problems with clarity in the financial statements, owners that work 100 hours a week. Like, all of these things cause the buyer to have doubts and concerns. And doubts and concerns equals risk. And so basically, as a seller, there's 2 choices. If you insist on getting a check on closing day and you have to be paid in full, what the buyer is going to do is the buyer is going to try to figure out what all of those different concerns of theirs are worth. They're going to discount your price. So instead of getting the $1 million that you want, you might have to accept less than half, because that what the buyer needs to be comfortable with all those risks. However, if you do still want to get $1 million, you probably can negotiate it if you share the risk with the buyer. And so this is where you get into these different structures where the buyer might say, well, I'll give you a down payment of this amount, and I want you to hold a seller financing note, and I'll pay you over several years. Or maybe I'll pay you this amount, but if these numbers are achieved, then there'll be this bonus payment after 4 years. And basically there's 101 different varieties of how you can structure these things, but it all comes down to the same thing. It's all about managing the perceived risk that the buyer sees, because the business is not buttoned up tight, the bow on top, everything done perfectly. When they are buttoned up tight with a bow on top and everything's taken care of perfectly, buyers come along and write a check because they have absolute confidence in what they're getting. And so basically I run into this all the time, where there are so many problems with a business that a lot of buyers just chicken out. They just don't want to make an offer because they just see all this risk, and they're like, there's no way I'm going to borrow money at the bank if this is the business is conditioned. Out to them, hey, this is a great opportunity, because what the seller has done is they've managed the business into a fashion that's made it unbankable. And so their only option to sell this thing is going to be to accept some kind of down payment from a buyer, and then they become the bank with offset clauses that cause discounts against that note if any of these things that they're telling the buyer turn out to be untrue. Sellers hate it. They absolutely hate it. If you've run your business in a lackadaisical, mismanaged fashion, this is the cost. This is the reckoning at the end. And this is probably another one of the reasons why 80% of small businesses don't sell. Because when business owners are faced with these kinds of offers, many of them probably just feel frustrated. They don't understand that this is realistic and what they can expect. And because they can't find the buyer that they expect to meet, they get frustrated and they leave the process.
Yeah, it's so well said. I've seen that so many times. And so I think what happens there in those cases, David, with those people, those situations where you have a business that you're selling that doesn't have all of those things, is sometimes those sellers need a little bit of time in the shock of reality that, oh, I did multiple offers that I wanted all cash. Like you said, some of them exit it's like it happens in real estate, right? Somebody has this inflated idea of what their home is worth, and then they don't get it. And so they take it personally, take the house off the market. But it's such an interesting dynamic. But I want to speak to for a moment, and then I'll pass it to Rocky, about the whole selling mindset and the identity challenges that come with this. But I always say there's 2 hardest decisions a business owner has to make. One is, when do I shut down a business that's not working? And that's the harder of the 2. Yeah, very hard decision to make. Instead, if we're able to, we keep it afloat and we keep inputting money and we accept not making any money. And the second hardest is selling a business. And it's interesting, having done both and having advised people, it's interesting how the advice you'll get, again, from the attorney or the CPA, who are not business owners at the same level. Oh, how are you going to replace that income? My philosophy, and this is just my philosophy, is that everything is always for sale. And we won't get personal about that, but every business is always for sale, in my opinion. Because the thing I always tell people when they're thinking, should I keep the business and keep making that money, is that we don't know what the risk is that might hit us 2 years from now that might completely change my ability to continue making that money. So I always look at it as if I can take that off the table and the timing is right, then I take that opportunity. But that's just my mindset. You were talking about back when you started your business, Giuseppe, and talking about exit planning. I think that's a more recent thing. I don't think 10 years ago people were as focused or even knew this term exit planning. At least that'd be interesting what you guys think. But now we think about those things, and rightly. But those are two things that I think add into it, the identity. I think of my David partner, David Begin, co-host of my podcast sometimes. We've talked about this on the show. He went through a major identity crisis when he sold his very successful car wash business. It was part of his life for 12 years. He was known as a highly successful car wash operator. He was the president of the International Car Wash Association period of time. Very respected. When he sold the business, he still to this day struggles a little bit with, okay, that was my identity. So I think we got to think about that mindset shift as well. I'll pass it to Rocky.
So we always like to say begin with the end in mind. And what everyone forgets about until April 15th is the tax bill on the sale. And depending on how the deal is structured, your tax bill is dramatically different. And it really just depends on how they're buying and how they're buying it. I can assure you that a smart buyer is setting it up for their benefit. So they want to make sure that they get the best situation from a tax standpoint. They also want the best situation from a liability standpoint. If I'm buying like a C Corp, I'm buying stock in that C Corp. I now own all the liability of the last however many years that company has been in business, including the current year tax liability. So these are all the things that you have to be aware of from that standpoint. What are the tax implications of how it's being done? And that also, if real estate's involved, how are those separated and how are the two transactions happening? What does that look like? The other side of this is, can I afford to sell? So I know a lot of business owners, they're like, I want to sell. I'm like, well, how much money do you have for retirement? Because your business is, generating $250,000 and you're going to sell it for $1 million. Woohoo. But $1 million, if you just use the 4% rule, which is a retirement rule, says you're going to get $40,000 in income for the rest of your life from that $1 million. You were making $250,000. How are you going to cover the other $210,000? What's going to, and that's really where business owners are like, oh, I really have to think this through a lot more. More often than not in those situations, they decide not to sell. They decide to put a manager in. Mm-hmm. So I could still pay a manager $125, and I could still make $125, and I still have a business.
I think that was a great point. I think that was in part what you were speaking to initially on this point, Giuseppe, right?
Yep, absolutely. That's a big part of it. You got to run those different scenarios because, as to Rocky's point on that 4% rule, which you factor in, you could pull 4, which I was following someone that was toying with the idea of 4 to 6% was the range. That's not going to cover your costs. You're going to be out there starting another business or getting another job. So once you can really reduce those expenses.
Have you guys ever heard the expression, if you don't sell it, you bought it?
If you don't sell it, you bought it.
Yeah. So it works like this. Like if somebody offers you $1 million for your business that maybe is cash flowing, $300,000 a year, and you go to your accountant and they tell you after taxes you would clear, $700,000. If you don't take that offer, what it means is that if you had $700,000 in the bank, you would write that check to acquire that business. So I'll ask people, if you had the $700,000 in the bank, would you do that deal, knowing what you know about this business? And it's interesting when people kind of turn the tables on this idea, like if I had the cash, would I buy this? And that's, it can sometimes sway people one way or the other, really, but it's a different way of looking at it. And, there is something to be said for exiting on an uptick. You have increasing sales and profits year after year, and you get that opportunity to exit, you're going to probably have an easier time selling. Then if you carry on for a few more years, have a little bit of trouble, have a downturn, have a reduction in profitability, it could become very difficult to sell. And so I have, coached a lot of people like, hey, maybe you should do this deal. The topic of, well, how can I afford to retire? I'm only 62. I don't earn enough money. And the solution is usually in the deal. to become an employee of the new owner. And they usually welcome this kind of opportunity because it means that they get to hang on to that access to all the historical knowledge, decision making, et cetera. And so, I've seen more than one person sell a business and then stay on as an employee for 5 or 6 years before retirement. And it can actually give the buyer greater confidence in doing the deal.
I don't like working for someone else.
There's definitely that part of it. But to your point, though, that could be one of the ways that you address that income gap that you have identified, right? But it still might make sense to sell. It comes to that same sweet salon business that I referred to. There were 2 reasons I decided to sell. One was a partnership challenge. And second was I saw the competitive landscape changing, and I knew that I was going to end up behind the curve there without significant investment. And the other thing is, though, that's so hard is when you sell, it is the right decision. You made that decision. If you look back and try to second guess it, boy, it's going to be a lot of sleepless nights. But great point, I think, on why sometimes you need to sell, even if it might not necessarily be that you have to do something else to cover the income gap.
Rocky just showed that selling for $1 million might only give you $40,000 a year in retirement. So what are the real options? In the final segment, the panel goes through ESOPs, selling to employees, Instagram tax advice traps, and delivers their final words of wisdom from this entire 3-part summit, including David's incredible story about bankruptcies and second chances.